Well, welcome to Diversifying Energy and the Opportunities in Alternative Power Generation. This is a 1 hour live streamed panel discussion, and it's part of MEED's Middle East and North Africa Power and Water Virtual Summit. So over the next hour, we're going to discuss with our panelists the state of play in the diversification of the region's energy sector. And then we're going to look at some of the alternative and new sources of energy, how far advanced they are, and of course what the impact will be of the introduction of new and an increasingly diversified supply of energy. And then we'll take a look at some of the specific country challenges as well. You can submit questions and get involved in this conversation. It's a very, very important conversation, obviously, by using the comments tab that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you have a question you want to submit to our panelists, or if you have some comments from your own experiences in the market or indeed in other markets, please do send in your comments using the tab on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will do our best to answer your questions as fully as we can. So I will now introduce our wonderful panelists, and then we will go into the discussion. I'm joined at the moment by Elie Matar, who is the head of electricity for the Dubai Regulatory and Supervisory Bureau, the RSB. Good morning, Elie. Thank you very much for your time today. It's great to have you. I'm also joined by Sudarshan TM, who is the Director for Government and Infrastructure at Deloitte in the UAE. And I'm absolutely delighted that Deloitte are sponsoring this session and supporting the MENA Power and Water Summit. Deloitte is a long-time partner with MEED in many of our events, and obviously is a very well-known consultant in the region with decades of experience and knowledge. So welcome, Sudarshan. Thank you very much for your time. Sudarshan, if I can come to you first. So as I said in my opening remarks this morning, the diversification of the energy sector has been quite a high priority for governments across the region for many years, to ensure energy security, to reduce the dependence on the region's dependence on oil and gas, and to conserve those important assets. And in the past couple of years especially, we've been seeing the increasing focus on decarbonisation and the introduction of new fuels, the potential of green hydrogen, the potential of waste to energy, and the whole narrative about a more diverse energy sector, it seems to be accelerating. What does it look like to you, Sudarshan, as a consultant who looks at this stuff in the macro level and in the detailed level? Where is the diversification of Middle East energy? Are we doing well? Where are the problems? And what do you expect to happen?
Thanks, Richard. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel. And as mentioned, Deloitte has been with MEED on quite a few events, and we're happy to kind of continue that relationship going forward. Exactly as you mentioned, renewable energy, energy security, energy transition, and more importantly, the importance of planning for a sustainable future has been going on for quite a while now. And they've been like ongoing themes for various governments in the region. And they've also formed part of their national energy strategies now. Now, energy transition particularly, at least we feel that should not be seen in black and white terms, because the reality is more complicated than what is shown, out there. Because in the past, we've seen that, solar panel and wind technologies have been essentially leading the way and kind of forging ahead, not only in Saudi and Jordan, UAE, stuff like that, but predominantly across the region itself. But, as more and more states start to take up, net zero targets in the coming years, the limitations of all these technologies should be considered, and they should be effectively addressed or mitigated in some form or the other to actually reach those targets. For example, the intermittency issues from solar or wind, it can be improved with battery storage, but the technology is still expensive. and it's not yet at a stage that's required that can deliver the required scale of output that there is. Additionally, other factors need to be considered. The waste from the batteries, for example, how are they going to be disposed once the equipment has reached the end of life? What about the solar panel waste, stuff like that? So there are quite a few issues when we consider the various new technologies that are coming up as well. Other new technologies like EVs, the electric vehicles. So I think about 4 or 5 months ago, Saudi signed an MOU with Schneider to effectively put quite a lot of charging stations in Saudi, which is consistent with the Saudi Vision 2030. But once again, we need to kind of carefully assess where this energy is coming from. What's the carbon footprint for these charging stations in itself, and that's key to achieving these net zero strategies. So, we are seeing, tariffs go down from solar, with every procurement. But how does this effectively reach the end customer? Are the grids infrastructure, strong enough to kind of deliver these, to the customer? Is there like last mile connectivity? Are all the users essentially connected up to the grid to realize these low tariffs that are actually coming through in the bids itself? So that's another kind of key point that needs to be considered. Hydrogen at this point of time seems to be, kind of to have a lot of promise and moving away from carbon intensive fuels while using the existing gas infrastructure that there already is. So there seems to be some promise. And countries like UAE and Saudi have made significant investment in both green and blue hydrogen plants. And the rest of the GCC, once again, is really well placed and pushing forward with their individual plans as well. Now, once again, the challenges remain regarding storage and pressure enhancing mechanisms to ensure that proper transmission is possible using the existing systems, the existing infrastructure in place. And once again, hydrogen production is prohibitively expensive compared to the other technologies. So once more, as we transition from these carbon intensive sources of fuel to like greener energy, there is going to be the use of natural gas as a transition fuel. That's not going to go away, but it is obviously significantly much cleaner than coal or diesel is. So there's nuclear power. Large scale nuclear power is possibly like one of the only technologies which can provide continuous low carbon electricity and will actually play a key role going forward in achieving these net zero targets itself. And obviously, Saudi is pushing forward to kind of get its nuclear plant online. UAE has already done it and receiving energy from this as well. Now, how do we essentially bring all these technologies together? How do we improve the conditions or provide conditions for growth of renewables in the power sector itself? How do we plan for grid interconnection? How do we get the private sector involved, like they've done on the generation side? I think these are some of the key points that need to be highlighted and need to be considered when we actually move forward towards in this energy transition phase towards net zero.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Sudarshan. Now, you've covered a lot of topics there, and I have many questions that to put to you. If anyone in the audience would like to follow up on any of the points that Sudarshan has mentioned, please use the comments tab on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can send in your questions for Sudarshan and for Elie and for Tarik once he's joined us. Sudarshan, so there was a lot in what you have said just now, and I'm aware that most of the people watching this will be looking at it from a business perspective. They'll be looking at business opportunities and investment trends. So if I can start on the generation side, which you mentioned in the opening part of your comments, we've seen so much success in particularly in the UAE and Saudi on the renewables solar programs over the past few years. But you mentioned the issues around storage and the issues around intermittency. So for me, that means we will continue to see a fair degree of investment in conventional power, or even you mentioned nuclear, big base load power plants that can provide that baseload. Is that your reading of it, that we are going to still see investment in those traditional, conventional power sources to provide that mix?
Well, yes, I do think that's I do think that's a fair assessment, Richard. There is going to be renewables which are being pushed forward on the generation side. There's going to be a mix that happens. We've seen wind come up in the region. Wind has actually been done in Saudi as well as Jordan. And they're testing it out in, I think, Egypt and Morocco as well. So there's quite a lot to actually add to the mix. So generation will continue. You are going to see baseload, the conventional power, like I say, using gas during this transition period, while we kind of sort out the technology issues, the kind of affordability issues from a government perspective when it comes to technologies like storage, etc. But that will eventually kind of start to taper off once we start to go towards this net zero targets itself. As technology increases, the prices are going to come down, and so that's the sort of trend that will follow. When it comes to nuclear itself, there cannot be too much investment that goes into nuclear because these are huge capex projects in itself. And essentially, once you started to do it, you don't want to keep investing in like 2 or 3 nuclear plants going forward, because these are here. I mean, France has done it. Almost 70% of France's electricity mix is actually contributed by nuclear. But the thing is, it's taken them so many years to actually come to this point of time. For a region that's just starting out, it's better to kind of try and assess, along with the increase in technology, how these can all be maximized to kind of reduce your baseload capex and effectively kind of offset that with cheaper, cleaner fuel.
Now, a lot of the, certainly in the power sector, a lot of the capacity that's been developed over the past 2 decades probably has come from private finance using IPP models and IWPP models. And it certainly seems like private finance is going to be critical to this investment program going forward. But investors nowadays are looking at ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors in their investment decisions. Do you think that is going to increase the focus on green energy and renewable energy because that's what investors are demanding, and that will further accelerate this agenda?
So there has started to be discussions in the financing circles about ESG, and the fact is not many people have done it in region, and the kind of reporting standards that there are, the kind of extra costs that are associated with it, all need to kind of go down a path of discovery almost before investors and start to get comfortable with using this, and governments start to get comfortable with the fact that they have to pay that little bit extra in order to have ESG against their names, or for the investment to be green in itself. But yes, it has started to be a focus globally as well as regionally, and we've noticed of late over the past few months the talks of ESG within the financing circles has only got stronger. So there definitely is interest with investors and with banks to at least assess, first of all, what is the art of the possible when it comes to ESG, and then essentially, kind of take things forward from there.
Okay, thank you. Now, one more question for you, Sudarshan, before I move on to Elie. We've had a question submitted by Wasim, and Wasim asks, he says, Sudarshan, when talking about hydrogen generation costs, and you are saying it is expensive still, where did you base your comparison? So Wasim is asking where, what your evidence is for the cost comparisons. What do you think about the cost of hydrogen generation using blue hydrogen, i.e. hydrogen that's derived from hydrocarbons, versus green hydrogen, which is hydrogen derived from water? So perhaps can you tackle any of those points that Wasim has asked?
Sure. So on the first one, when I was talking about hydrogen generation cost and saying it's expensive, this was basically in comparison to the greener fuels that we're seeing now, things like solar, etc., which and the bids that are essentially kind of coming through the cost of generation when concerned with that. So I probably should have said that it's a relatively more expensive than the other technologies that we're seeing now. So I do stand corrected there.
On that point, we were in a similar position probably 10 years ago with photovoltaics, weren't we? The cost of those were much higher than they are today, and the development of scale has brought down the cost of solar, hasn't it? I presume we can expect that from green hydrogen.
We could hope so. I mean, we can only wait and watch, right, how technology goes and the kind of advances that are made in this regard, how much R&D is put in. All these, I suppose only time will tell. I mean, it has worked out for solar. It has worked out for the governments who are putting out these solar projects to kind of reap these benefits of low cost. But we just need to wait and watch on the hydrogen side. Hopefully it will.
So, Sudarshan, thank you very much. I will give you a break for a few minutes and I will introduce Elie Matar. Now, Elie, thank you very much for your patience. You are the head of electricity at the Dubai Regulatory and Supervisory Bureau. And Dubai, as always, is really pioneering the region's drive into renewables and green hydrogen and alternative fuels as well. And of course, other emirates, Sharjah, Abu Dhabi, are also making quite very important steps into these segments too. So, Elie, perhaps I'm interested to know just what does it mean for regulators? This diversification of energy supply, the privatization, PPP, etc., etc. What sort of challenges does it mean for you?
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Sudarshan, for all the comments that you made. And obviously, given the discussion so far, you can tell how big of a load this is on a regulator. So this is what it means for us. It means there's a load on our shoulders to make sure that the sector is operating securely, reliably, efficiently. And we try to do that through ensuring an effective and independent regulatory regime. And given the fast pace, and as you mentioned, Dubai is most of the time pioneering in what it does, given that fast pace and aggressive targets and aggressive initiatives, we have to keep up with all of that. And I think the shift started early in the last decade when the IPP law was issued in Dubai, allowing for public-private partnerships in energy and generation and water production. And the Bureau was established shortly after that to make sure that this transition happens smoothly and that there's an independent body that looks at the sector from that point of view and makes sure that the participation of the private sector happens in the most efficient and reliable way. And along with that, also, as you rightly mentioned, Dubai sets aggressive targets, and those who are familiar with the landscape in Dubai probably know about the different strategies that were announced since then. There was the Dubai Integrated Energy Strategy 2030, and then out of that came a DSM strategy that looks at the supply, at the demand side, not just the supply side. And now with more net zero strategies being announced, that it's also always important to mention that it's both, it has both effect on the supply and the demand side. It's not just that we produce more clean energy, we also need to use less of it because that's cleaner than actually producing energy. So in the Dubai Integrated Energy Strategy, there were aggressive targets for clean energy, and then 2050, the Clean Energy Strategy of 2050 made those targets even more aggressive. So we started with 7% clean energy in 2020, 25% in 2030, and 75% in 2050. And another target that was added recently was the net zero by 2050. So obviously, all of that needs a regulatory regime that makes sure things happen in a, as I mentioned, in a secure, reliable, and efficient way. And the shift that started in the early last decade was important in terms of diversifying not just the technologies that are used, but also the structure of the projects, the financing of those projects, the partnerships taking place. So moving a little away from the traditional utility-owned power plant to the PPP structure. And back to what Sudarshan mentioned, and you emphasized that in the foreseeable future, we will still see the conventional plant operating, and even some of them being built. So DEWA, for example, continues with its plans to expand at least the existing power generation capacity, but at the same time partner with the private sector to build new plant with new technologies. And Dubai has succeeded in that, as you know, with world records in PV and renewable projects. So nowadays, by the time you hear about a world record, another project is trying to break it. So, and as you mentioned, that drop in solar tariffs has been substantial over the past few years. And I can give you an example. In Dubai, for example, we started in 2015 by close to 6 cents per kilowatt hour, and now we're down to 1.7 or even less, not now, even 2 years ago. So in less than 5 years, we've seen a drop in 70%. And in the past, in 2 years, we've seen a drop of around 50%. So that is expected. Also, jumping to another topic that you just covered, hydrogen. So that is expected to be mirrored into hydrogen as well, because given the economies of scale, given the reduced tariffs on the renewable side, given the potential that the GCC countries have in terms of yield for renewable resources, especially solar, given the availability of land, given the access to seawater, and also given the probably the low domestic consumption of hydrogen, we can be exporters in the GCC of hydrogen, given that we look at the value chain and see where exactly we can add value and what needs to be done. And this links back to our role as RSB and the way Dubai does things, that there's a clear separation of responsibilities, clear targets set, clear KPIs, and clear ways of measuring and verifying progress towards those KPIs. So, for example, we've licensed a lot of all of the IPPs in Dubai. We've licensed some captive plant, but when it came to rooftop solar, for example, it was determined that this could lie more efficiently within DEWA's remit. So they have the Shams Dubai program, so it's under their responsibility as a regulator. We do not get involved in that initiative, but we do when it comes to utility scale production. So all of that entails a lot of responsibility and duties. It should also worth mentioning the documents that we own and review periodically, the IPP code, for example, and the renewable standards. So those are proving more and more important, especially given the pace that renewables are developing at. And for example, our renewable standards are very agile by design. So they are technology agnostic, and they treat new developments based on the technologies that they use, the penetration of these technologies, and the size of the project. So as we build new projects, as technologies advance, automatically those standards are adapting to those new technologies and new projects.
Okay, so you've touched on, as with Sudarshan, you've touched on a whole range of very complex and important issues. If I can just ask you about a couple of those issues. You mentioned rooftop solar there, and I know this is only a small part of the equation. But I think rooftop solar must be quite an interesting challenge from a regulatory point of view. And I'm curious to know, what's the responsibility of the regulator? Do you approve the sort of the technical aspects of rooftop solar, or is it about the feed-in tariffs if people have surplus electricity feeding it into the national grid, or is it something else? What is the role of certainly in Dubai, of the regulator when it comes to those smaller or non-utility scale projects?
I'd say when it comes to non-utility scale projects, our role is smaller than when it comes to utility scale projects. So we're not actively involved in Shams Dubai initiative. We were heavily involved early on when the scheme was being designed and developed.
Shams Dubai initiative. This is the Dubai initiative to encourage and promote rooftop solar for industrial facilities
and residential as well. So any rooftop in Dubai. So when that was being developed, we were part of the team working on the standards and on the design of the scheme, and from there on, it's DEWA's responsibility. So we don't get involved, especially given the scale of these. On one hand, they're small-scale projects. On the other hand, they're scattered all over Dubai. They deal with the distribution network, whereas we're more involved when there are connections to the transmission network. So DEWA has done a great job in setting standards for the technical equipment, for the consultants, for manufacturers, for installers. People can go to DEWA's website and find lists of those accredited or approved consultants, contractors, and manufacturers. And DEWA has also set certain conditions for those connections in terms of technical standards and in terms of capacity, for example, how much you can install on the rooftop to guarantee safety and also reliability of the network.
Okay, and then one final question before I move to the audience questions. One final question from me. Obviously, a major part of your work as a regulator is to install the regulations, but then another major part of your work is the actual supervision and enforcement of those regulations. So in terms of net zero carbon targets and the greenness or cleanness of the electricity that's generated, how do you regulate that, or how do you enforce that? Do producers have to provide standard reports about their carbon consumption or emissions, and how do you check that? Because that must be an entirely new set of processes.
Okay. Well, we're not going to jump to 2050 when we're reaching net zero, but I can say what we're doing now is that when utility scale projects are being launched, we make sure that proper environmental assessment studies have been done, that these follow the standards that they should follow. And on a yearly basis, we collect data from those producers. And
they have to provide you with a report on certain metrics and outputs.
Yeah. Now emissions are looked at by other entities in Dubai, but what we make sure is that the plant is built based on the proper international standards and local standards. And we get annual reports from IPPs on their production levels. For example, in 2020, more than 6% of the grid requirement was met by renewable energy, which might not sound that huge, but going from 0 to 6 in a few years is quite an achievement. And in terms of capacity, not production, today we're at 18% of the grid generation capacity from clean energy. And in 2 years, it's expected to even exceed 30%. So back to your question on how do we, there's the regulatory part of our work and there's the supervisory part of our work. We keep a close eye on the operations of our licensees. We ask for annual reports. We visit their sites whenever needed, and we make sure that they are complying with the conditions of their license and complying with all the applicable laws and regulations in Dubai.
Elie, I've got one question here from Carlos. I don't know actually if this is something you can answer, or if perhaps it falls to another authority, but why is Dubai investing in coal-based generation, as it seems to go against the UAE's net zero ambitions? Now, I mean, maybe you're not in a position to talk about the coal project, but what are your thoughts, or what are the sort of regulatory thoughts on that? Does coal fit within the general agenda?
Sure. Maybe it's a discussion that can be had in a different setup, but I can address that in a way. First of all, that plant was planned long before the net zero ambitions were in place. Well, ambitions have always been in place, but the new strategy has just been announced, and it's not just coal plant; it's clean coal. So again, back to my comment earlier, there are certain standards that are being followed when it comes to emissions and provisions for carbon capture as well, which might be implemented in the future. But I would say the main reason for investing is diversification, which is the topic of our session today. It's not just the opportunities for alternative energy, it's also diversification and making sure we have enough diverse sources of energy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos, for your question. Now, Sudarshan, we have a question from Murad, and this is about price tariffs across the MENA region. So what is the average price tariff for solar across the MENA region? We've heard from Elie just now about how the tariffs have fallen in Dubai over the past decade for renewables. Are we seeing the same pattern across the region? Is it continuing to fall? Is the UAE or Dubai in a sort of unique island of its own price regime, and others are way behind still? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Richard. So, there has been a history of seeing solar prices like, each a world record is set and then someone else comes along and betters that. So it has been a kind of falling trend. But what we've seen recently in Saudi seems to go a little against that trend, seems to buck that trend. Now we need to see, first of all, whether this is going to continue or not. Because
sorry, what do you mean? What do you mean Saudi has bucked the trend?
It's not bucked. It's probably a blip in the trend that's seen. There is a little uptick when it comes to the prices that you've seen in the recent Saudi bids that have been opened. So, there is also only a particular point of time to which there is only so low you can go without kind of trying to eat into your own equity returns or your equity IRR in itself. The project has to be sustainable at the end of the day. So once again, like I said, technology kind of has been defeating all these sort of all sorts of reasoning, and we see prices of modules keeping on falling, I think for the last 10, 15 years almost, to where it is right now. Now, I think going forward, there should be an emphasis on trying to make plants more sustainable and, try to make sure that while cheap electricity is being produced, it doesn't come at too heavy a price at the end of the day. Because if it's unsustainable for a developer, it's not going to be good for him or for the government itself, which is purchasing this electricity. So there has to be some sort of rationalization, if I could call it that. Now, once again, it just leaves to be seen how low can low go. And I think we just need to wait and watch once again, because at the end of the day, technology determines.
We've seen, post-COVID, with COVID, obviously, the pandemic has disrupted production and supply chains of, production of raw materials, the manufacturing supply chains, and then the end use. So, and now we are seeing this sort of post-COVID spike in inflation, which is it transitory because of bottlenecks in the supply chain, or is it permanent because of all the the stimulus spending, etc.? Is it your sense that these blips in Saudi Arabia with the tender prices or the tariff prices recently going up slightly, is that short term because of this post-COVID inflationary spike and the bottlenecks, or do you think actually we've reached some sort of what do you call it, a sort of bottoming out of prices? It can't really go much lower, and we now need to look at other ways to drive efficiencies?
I'm not really sure it's like a bottoming out of prices, because like I said, I think that just needs to be seen based on how which trajectory the technology advances actually take, because it's directly relevant to your the levelized tariff which is being paid on projects like this. But when it does, you're right in the sense of saying on the COVID side, there was a sense of supply chain disruptions causing, some sort of a risk, additional risk, with people pricing stuff in, with the lenders and the investors wanting to price some of this risk in, which could have a little bit of an effect. But once again, given the size and scale of what the Middle East is looking at, I think that, eventually this will taper off and people will start to go back to, what they were doing pre-COVID in itself. So I do think that the COVID risk pricing is temporary and could potentially fizzle out, if things don't continue as they have. That is, but I think that's temporary. But when it does come to bottoming out of prices, I'm not so sure about that. I think, like I said, we just need to wait and watch.
Okay, thank you. Now, Elie, after this panel discussion, I will be moderating a panel that looks at waste to energy, and obviously, I mean, we're at a sort of early stage in the development of waste to energy plants, and my understanding of this new technology is that waste is not as efficient in fuel generation as, say, gas or even solar. So it can't compete as purely in terms of cost, but it is, of course, a way to stop sending waste to landfill, and it is, of course, an alternative source. So there's a diversification part of it. Does the regulator do you have sort of policies that encourage certain types of technologies and certain schemes? So waste to energy might not be attractive to investors, potentially, but it's attractive to government. And does the regulator come in there to incentivize certain technologies or certain processes over others?
Thank you, Richard. Good question. And I'd like to distinguish between those two things that you mentioned, policy and regulation. So when we look at regulation, we try not to set policies through regulations, but the other way around. There are policies, there are strategies, and we put in place regulations that would serve those policies. So as a short answer, we do not structure our regulation to push for a specific technology, or we do not influence policies to go in a certain direction. But what we do is that when there are strategies and policies, we make sure that the regulations in place support the implementation, proper implementation of those policies and strategies. And on waste to energy or energy from waste, I think we cannot just look at the pure LCOE or tariff for the electricity generation part, because there is a component of that goes towards waste management anyway. So you're getting that electricity as part of more efficiently processing your waste, which you have to either send to a landfill or process in any other way. And we have licensed a project here in Dubai, actually a 200 megawatt waste to energy plant. And it might not be as efficient as other technologies if we're strictly speaking about electricity generation, but it also depends on the type of waste, on how you sort it, how you process it, and why you're doing that in the first place.
Would that fall under? You're the head of electricity for the RSB in Dubai. So the waste, the collection of waste, the categorization of waste, the recycling, it all starts to become a bit blurred, doesn't it? Is that electricity or is it, something
That's
else?
not that part is not under our remit. But what we do is we license the plant, the generation plant. So the licensed activities are very specific. They're the production of electricity through the technology that is being used, and we specify what's the production capacity, the maximum production capacity, and this is what we look at. We don't get involved in the waste management part, which is with other entities to look at.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a comment from Krishna, and if any of you want to send in your comments or submit questions for our panelists, please use the comment tab that's on the right-hand side of your screen.
Richard, if you allow me, maybe we didn't fairly answer Murad's question. He asked about average prices of solar.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Elie.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's an average price, but just to give him an idea, and also touching on what the projects that Sudarshan mentioned. So a few months ago, there was an announcement in Saudi of a PV project reaching close to a little over 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And then later on, more recently, there was a jump to, if I'm not mistaken, around 1.6. So that's back to a figure that we achieved in Dubai in 2019, and we expect new projects to achieve less. Whether those prices have bottomed, I agree with Sudarshan. It's early to say that, and I have the impression that they haven't. But it always depends on what's happening around the world: energy prices, supply, material resources. So a lot of factors play into this. But I wanted to give those couple of figures to Murad just to give him an idea.
I mean, as a regulator, do you regularly sort of benchmark the tariffs that are being charged in Dubai? So if we look at the world record, as you mentioned, just over 1 cent per kilowatt hour, do you then look at other markets in the region, Saudi Arabia you mentioned, and around the world, and sort of benchmark, or are there too many variables to do that? You just have to focus on what you've got in your market?
There are too many variables. Chile has been successful at achieving world records as well. So you have to keep an eye on what's happening around the world, but and stay abreast of the technologies and what prices are being achieved. But again, each region has its specific circumstances, conditions, and potential for different technologies. But yes, we do keep an eye on what's happening around the world. And as I mentioned, we handle the regulation part, not the policy part. So even though we stay informed, we do inform policies and strategies, but we do not structure our regulations to push in a certain direction.
Hydrogen initially should be explored from an industrial applications point of view, e.g. replacing coal and natural gas in steel production, for example. Blue hydrogen maybe looked more as a strategy for diversification of Middle East economies, remaining within the ESG requirements of global funds. So I think Krishna is sort of describing a strategic approach to the adoption of hydrogen as a way of diversifying away from pure oil and gas sources rather than just on price. Does that sound about right, Sudarshan?
So the thing is, there are different ways to look at it. When you actually look at it from a use perspective, most of the energy goes towards the industrials. And when you're looking to kind of, if hydrogen is going to kind of deliver this low-cost promise, it's obviously going to help people, one, in their bottom line. The companies actually go down in expense and try to pass that on to the end consumer in itself. So there are advantages of doing that. But once again, for them to test it on an actual industrial scale, that requires commitment, that requires R&D, that requires resources as well. to actually undertake a lot of this. And I think once again, we just need to wait and see once the technology increases to a limit where this sort of testing is possible. I think that's when that would essentially become achievable, but it definitely is a way to look at it, because the industrial side is they are the places where the maximum consumption of electricity does happen. So if you're able to kind of shave some of that off, and try and get hydrogen to replace coal or natural gas, like Krishna said in steel production, it is going to kind of filter down throughout, and it's going to be useful for everyone. But once again, like I said, we just need to wait and watch to see whether the technology comes to a point where they're able to test all this in an industrial level.
Okay, thank you. Now, Elie, we have a question here from Bayan. Is there any green funding scheme in the UAE? And you represent Dubai rather than the UAE, but is there any green funding scheme for individuals who want to install solar systems in their home? Such schemes would encourage people to participate in achieving the UAE vision to be carbon neutral by 2050. So you mentioned the Shams scheme earlier, but what sort of initiatives are you aware of in the UAE or in Dubai to promote, sort of uptake of solar?
There is a green fund in Dubai. I would invite Bayan to take a look at the website and see what they offer. Now, I'm not sure they offer funding to small-scale projects, but they might do. I'm not in a position to judge on that. But there are schemes supporting that. There are banks that are offering loans that take that into consideration. There are companies that might find solutions for that. So if you contact some of the consultants who are involved in Shams Dubai initiative, they might be in a position to help even more. And just a short answer that there is a green fund. Now, how accessible that is, at what scale, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, Bayan has submitted a short follow-up question, which is about the Northern Emirates. So I guess it's a follow-on question to the Green Fund question. I don't know if either of you are in a position to talk about the Northern Emirates, but do you know, Elie, that if these funds are UAE-wide, or if there are any funds that are UAE-wide, or Sudarshan, are you aware of such things? Elie first.
Not entirely sure. Actually, as we speak, I think there's another conference happening somewhere else where the executive director of the Ras Al Khaimah relevant department might be talking about these things. But a lot of stuff is happening around the Emirates. In the Northern Emirates, there is at least a bureau within the RAK municipality that looks at these. But if there are funding schemes for those, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. And I imagine that I haven't looked, but the Ministry of Climate Change may well have some information on its website about this. Okay, so we've talked a lot about generation and the sort of the different initiatives to promote diversification on the generation side. Sudarshan, on the transmission and distribution side of electricity, what are the sort of ramifications that people should be aware of? I mean, the different, you talked about intermittency issues, for example, and we hear about smart grids, investment in sort of more efficient grids. Is that part of this story?
It is. It absolutely is. I think it starts off with trying to boost your grid infrastructure to essentially, first of all, connect these renewable energy sources, because all of them are spread out all over the place. Essentially, first you need to widen your grid, and then essentially look to how to integrate all these within the actual the UAE grid itself, or the Saudi grid, to essentially make use of the power that is being generated by solar, by wind, etc., to actually make sense of these low costs that are being seen. So smart grids does play in as well, and it's going to optimize the way in which power is used, power is dispatched, etc. Grid efficiency would increase as well, and all of these are, there have been a lot of countries, there have been around the world which have tested smart grids, which are continuing to test smart grids, even in the Middle East. There are a few pockets. There are utilities which are testing out smart grids at various levels. Now, it just needs to be so. It is coming. It is the way in which the world needs to move, I suppose, because you need digital assistance to essentially make sense of which sort of power to actually use or dispatch, not only on a merit order basis. It's currently used as well. So it's just about it is a necessity, and I do think that all the signs are there to actually show that it is coming soon.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm delighted. I can see Tarik has been able to join us. Welcome, Tarik. We've been talking with Elie and Sudarshan about the diversification of energy around the region and focus on Dubai and on some of the regulatory aspects. You are the Development Managing Director and a member of the Executive Committee for MASEN, the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy. Could you just tell us a little about what is the picture in Morocco? How diversified is Morocco's energy sector, and what are the targets?
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. So, as you know, Morocco is not a producer of gas or oil or any fossil oil for fossil energy. So we do import most of our need from such fossil. And from 2009, the state decided to had a strategy for the power generation based on renewables with a clear target of 42% from renewables energy by 2020 and 52 by 2030. So by today, we are almost reaching our target of 2020, which is we have 38% installed capacity from renewables, wind, solar, and hydro. In terms of number, it's almost 4,000 megawatt already under operation. Mainly hydro, we have 1,700, wind almost 1,400 megawatt, and solar more than 850 megawatts. And there is many projects also under construction or under the final stage of development that will be connected in the grid within the next 3 years. So we hope that, in fact, we'll be reaching our target of 2030 earlier, because most of the power generation projects that are now under construction or development are renewables. And this is thanks, of course, to the great quality of wind and solar generation we have here in Morocco.
And in terms of the focus of your future energy investments, is it balance between hydro, wind, and solar, as you just described, or are you looking to go into other alternative areas, green hydrogen, waste to energy, I don't know, biomass? Where do you see the investment focus?
Yeah, in terms of diversification, so the hydro, as I said, we have already 1,700 megawatt under operation. Most of the new project to be developed in the future will be hydraulic pumping storage unit, like use it for storage. But in terms of pure generation, some new project, but the quantity will not be such big, because we are quite close to use the whole capacity we have in terms of hydro. But the main development will be in wind sector and the solar sector. Basically, we expect to add at least 6 giga of new capacity between 2000 and between now and 2030, new capacity in addition of the ones that are already under development. So, and we hope that by 2030 we will have something like 11 or 12 giga of renewables to serve the need of the grid. In the meantime, we are looking to development of green hydrogen. Maybe as you know, Morocco has been identified of one of the best place in the world in terms of capacity to produce green hydrogen. because we have good resources of wind and solar, and because we have the two together combined. This is allow us to have a quite interesting capacity factor that can be used for the electrolyzers on a quite similar, quite close to a base load. And this can, of course, support the great development of green hydrogen. We are close to the big market, which is the European market, that is requesting now green hydrogen. We have also interconnections in terms of power, but also in terms of gas pipeline, and of course infrastructure that allow us to export green hydrogen. And in that field, we are starting development of mini project. Many developers are looking to Morocco as a base to produce green hydrogen to serve this market.
And where do you see, we don't have much time, so I'm sorry if I'm a bit quick on this. Where do you see the investment coming from? I mean, obviously the Gulf investors such as Aquapower and Masdar, and these have got lots of money and they're keen to get into these future energy scenarios. Are you seeing a lot of Gulf money coming into Morocco, or is it coming from Europe or even just from Morocco?
I mean, if we look at just to the renewables, we have investors from all the world. I mean, European, Asian, from Gulf also, from North America. And for the green hydrogen, if I'm just counting the one that are now exploring, we have from different fields, of course, North America, Europe, Gulf, the ones you mentioned, but also Asian, Japan are also interesting by there. So we will, I mean, say all the developers coming to explore here.
Okay, and I presume that for Morocco, as well as its own domestic use, green hydrogen would be an export focused commodity, exporting into France or into Europe, I imagine. Sorry, into Spain or Europe.
We have, I mean, both. We have internal use, because Morocco is one of the big important in terms of green ammonia, because we are one of the we are the largest exporter of phosphate and fertilizers. So we need this green ammonia with ammonia for this production. So of course hydrogen can be used for generating green ammonia, and of course we are also considering the export to Europe. Germany is one of the most involved now in the field, and they are ready to support project. Of course, other countries, Netherlands, France, are also looking to such kind of development. And of course, we are open to work with others, including, of course, companies from the Gulf area.
Well, Tarik, I'm delighted that we were able to bring you in at the end there. I'm sorry that you had such technology problems getting this. So thank you very much for your perseverance, and it's great to hear from you. I wish we had a little bit longer, but unfortunately we've run out of time for this panel. So thank you to the audience, to all of you for watching and for sending in your questions. But most important of all, thank you to Sudarshan, the Director for Government and Infrastructure at Deloitte, to Elie Matar, the Head of Electricity from Dubai Regulatory and Supervisory Board, and Tarik Hamane, the Development Managing Director and Member of Executive Council from MASEN, the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a fantastic conversation. I wish you lots of success in your endeavours ahead, and I look forward to seeing you soon sometime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.